If you've ever asked yourself why 50 plus years after the Civil Rights Act and why in the wake of a huge multi-billion diversity industry, we still don't have racial parity at work, I think this will give you some answers.
Job contracts lay out the basics like research, teaching, and service pretty clearly. But it's really how we interact at work that can make a big difference in our careers. Getting to know your colleagues, understanding organizational culture, and finding the right people to guide and support you as you move up the ladder can all be critical to success.
So when I talk about gray areas, I'm talking about the parts of our jobs that are a core part of how we work but may not be a written, explicit part of the work that we do. Gray areas, as I've defined them, are present for workers writ large. Everyone has to understand the organizational culture. Everyone has to go through this process of trying to get a job and forming the connections and networks that they need to land in a job.
While not as formal or strictly governed, these factors play a vital role for anyone navigating the work world. However, for individuals grappling with racial inequality, actively mastering these less clear-cut areas becomes particularly challenging, especially in environments that seem fair at first.
For Black workers, those experiences don't always land quite the same way. And there's a lot of room and opportunity for racial inequalities and racial discrimination to persist through those gray areas. It's really critical for companies to follow evidence-based steps to addressing these types of issues.
At Washington University in St. Louis, Professor Adia Harvey Wingfield studies how race, gender, and class intersect to shape social interactions in the workplace. Her latest book, Gray Areas: How the Way We Work Perpetuates Racism and What We Can Do to Fix It, explores how these nuanced workplace dynamics can perpetuate racial inequalities using real-world examples and in-depth analysis. The book also offers solutions for organizations to address these challenges effectively.
If you as a company want to be prepared to meet the challenges of society, if you want to be the best organization that you can, if you really want to make sure that your organization is thriving, you can't do that if you're using outdated, old, yesterday's models of what a company looks like and does and how it operates. If you really want to meet the needs of today, you got to be a diverse organization that reflects the diversity of the population. And that means being more attuned to and aware of how Black workers' experiences are shaped in your organization and changing those for the better.
It is wonderful to have you joining us today, Adia. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
It's my pleasure. Well, you made it easy with such an incredible book. But for our viewers who may not be familiar with the concept, let's start with a fundamental understanding. What do we mean by gray areas?
So when I talk about gray areas, I'm talking about the parts of our jobs that are a core part of how we work but may not be a written, explicit part of the work that we do. I'm a college professor. My job requires research, teaching, service, sometimes a lot of service, but those are the core things that you'll find in my contract. What my job doesn't specify are the other parts of work, which are forming relationships with colleagues if I want people to write me recommendation letters, or making sure that I understand the organizational culture in my workplace, or trying to find a mentor or a sponsor if I want to move up the ladder in my job. Those are the social, the cultural, and the relational parts of work, and they are a bit more ambiguous. They are less regulated, but they are also the areas where we have a lot of opportunity for racial inequality to persist. And that's what I'm talking about when I reference the gray areas in our workplaces.
Understood. Does everyone experience or encounter the gray areas?
Gray areas, as I've defined them, are present for workers writ large. Everyone has to understand the organizational culture. Everyone has to go through this process of trying to get a job and forming the connections and networks that they need to land in a job. But we also know from the work that I've tried to illustrate here that for Black workers, those experiences don't always land quite the same way. And there's a lot of room and opportunity for racial inequalities and racial discrimination to persist through those gray areas in ways that are present for them but may not be the case for other workers.
Now, these things aren't written in our job descriptions and our evaluations, but they're so clear and present.
A job description or a job contract is not going to specify. Part of your job is to learn the organizational culture here and figure out how to manage it, right? But those are things that workers end up doing on their own. So if we take organizational culture, for example, one of the stories that I draw from in the book is someone named that I call Brian, who's a film director. And so Brian talks about working at this company where there was such an explicit focus on being innovative innovative and being creative and bringing new, different stories. But whenever Brian tried to do that and focus on stories that related to different aspects of the Black experience, he was always met with this argument that these stories don't make money. And there's no reason for us to invest in these stories with Black leads or with Black directors because we're not going to get a return on our investment. So what Brian found was that the organizational culture of his workplace was one that purported to be focused on these visionary ideas, but was really very colorblind and hid behind this market-based culture in finding reasons and excuses for why they couldn't be very racially diverse when it came to the products that they were putting out. And so that becomes an example of how these types of situations operate, right?
They justified why they can't do the stories because of this market-based culture. Now, there's a series of cultures that you're able to identify. Will you also share about those in addition to the market-based ones, and maybe even rank them in best of the worst?
Oh, wow.
But let's define what those are, those kinds of environments.
Sure. So the organizational cultures that I specify in the book, in addition to market-based, there's the hierarchy culture where the focus is very much on workers following established rules and norms and hierarchies that are present in the workplace. There's the clan culture, where there's the focus on workers coming together to form decisions and to do so as a group and to do so very collectively. And there's the adhocracy culture, which is the move fast and break things, flaunt the rules, think outside of the box, do things differently. And one of the things that I found interesting in working on this book is that I was able to pull together workers who stem from a variety of these different organizational cultures. But what I found consistently was that all of these cultures were really disadvantageous for them in various ways, right? Whether they were in a market-based culture or a clan culture or hierarchy or adhocracy, they still were finding obstacles present in how the organizational cultures were structured because usually they were not structured with Black workers or Black workers' experiences in mind.
So were they formed initially? Like these are the actual structures that created the cultures, or did that evolve based on how we interact and progress in our companies
I think
have opportunities?
Yeah, I think it's some of both. I think that most companies aren't constructed with the idea of what diversity really means. We talk so much about that in our workplaces, right? But I think it's very rare that companies actually, leaders in companies actually think to themselves, if it means bringing in more Black workers, they're going to have specific experiences. How can we be cognizant of those experiences and construct a culture that reflects that? I don't think that's what typically happens. I think that much more often, companies drive, and leaders in companies drive an organizational culture that reflects their own experiences or what they value. That's not always inclusive of what Black workers are encountering. So I think it's a history of both, the kind of long-term history of an organization and people who were in leadership there.
How is this an outgrowth of where the slavery economy was in place?
Yeah. So the way that I think about it is that when I think historically about the relationships between race, work, and labor, those things have always been interconnected in ways that we don't always think about. But if we look historically, work has always been a way of maintaining racial inequality, and that's one of the core claims that I make in this book. If we think about the slavery economy, it was pretty evident and pretty blatant that people who were enslaved were not able to receive the fruits of their labor. They were considered property. They worked enormously, very, very hard and did enormously difficult tasks. But work was a way to, and keeping the fruits of their labor was a way to make sure that they were consistently rendered unequal and disadvantaged under the economy of that time period. When we fast forward a little bit to the post-slavery era, we start to see their pretty explicit, legally sanctioned racial discrimination. And so how work operates there to maintain racial inequality is that the types of jobs that are high status, economically rewarding, have opportunities for mobility, those are not jobs to which Black people have access. They are legally prohibited in many cases from holding those jobs. And there are enormous hurdles and barriers, even in getting the educational training that would position them to hold those jobs and even do them on a small scale. So what I think has happened as a result of this history of the interconnection of race and work and labor is that we've implicitly come to see certain types of jobs as ones that don't belong to or are not suited for or are not the province of Black people. And this comes really clear when I talk with some of the workers in this book. Max, for instance, who's an emergency medicine doctor who really had a lot of experiences with overt racial bias from his patients in many cases. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that they were unprepared to see a black man working in that job, and they pretty much told him that in no uncertain terms.
Yeah.
But that ties back to this history of how for a long time work has been a way that we have maintained racial divides, because black people have not had access to or been supported in moving into certain jobs. They have instead been historically rendered to low income, low wage work that doesn't really provide economic reward or economic mobility. And so when we start to think and talk now about how that's changing and how that can change, it makes a lot of people uncomfortable.
It does.
Because they're not accustomed to seeing or thinking about black people in those types of work.
Which then brings into two B words, bias. And now the evolution of diversity focus.
Yeah.
We went from diversity to diversity and equity
Yep.
to diversity, equity, and inclusion
Right.
to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging.
Right.
So that bias then is, well, you don't belong here. You mentioned someone came to work early and were mistaken for maybe groundskeeper or something because, I just can't see
Right.
you in this space. That's going to play out in every aspect of their work.
Yes, that's really common. I've had so many black workers, particularly those who are in high status positions, tell me how frequently that's happened, that they've been barred from a parking lot in one case, barred from access to the building where they were employed, barred from getting into the particular suite of offices where they worked. I mean, it's just routine in many cases.
I've seen arrested,
Oh, yeah.
all of that.
Yeah.
So we're looking for that
Yeah.
to stop happening.
Right. At a minimum, yes.
Right. Can we start there?
Right.
Can I not be arrested
Right.
and belong and be included?
Yes.
And I know that it evolves. The turnover is high in diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. From your perspective, will you define those for us?
Yeah. So if we're talking about diversity, I think we're talking about bringing in people from different backgrounds. If we're talking about equity, it's having the same opportunities to be included as part of an organizational structure. Inclusion is being able to kind of bring your whole self to work, so they say. Belonging is feeling as if your workplace is a place where you fit in and you belong and you are welcomed and supported. Now, these definitions may vary depending on the company in question. Some companies will think about diversity so broadly that it doesn't take race into consideration because they feel more comfortable focusing on things like diversity of thought or diversity of opinion, which also allows them to avoid dealing with some of the systemic barriers that I talk about in gray areas,
Yeah.
right?
Which makes it a gray area.
Yeah, exactly.
Great choice.
Yeah. So those are my definitions, but I think it's useful also to look at how companies are characterizing those terms because there's a lot of room to either focus very precisely and specifically on systemic racial disparities or to avoid those altogether.
You mentioned being able to utilize relationships and the social constructs. You've heard the phrase, your coworkers are not your friends.
Yeah.
But there's this thin line of, hey, you are my friend.
Right.
In order for me to function, to progress, to find community, and so many other things. How do we find the balance, or is there such a thing?
One of the other things that I talk about in the book is how much these connections and these friendships matter in terms of getting hired and how much black workers are disadvantaged by frequently being excluded from those types of networks. One of the stories that I include is Kevin, who is a worker who started off in the financial industry and moved to the nonprofit sector. And he talks about how he has these networks that are born out of his time at a historically black college and university. He has these networks that are born out of living in New Orleans for a period of time, but those networks are very racially homogenous. They're predominantly black people that he knows, black middle-class workers, and they have the opportunity to be friendly enough to get him in the door, but they don't have the connections to these really high-status leadership positions. So already he's at a bit of at a loss because he doesn't have these networks and connections that can move him into high-status jobs. So I think we want to be mindful of how our networks and making friends at work can be beneficial to us in some ways, but it's also useful to be aware of how for black workers, again, there are often some limits to the benefits that can provide.
Share a little bit about your experience. You have a dad.
Yes.
You're a second generation
Right.
academic. You still needed, and even the young lady in the sciences, where if it weren't for her mentor, like these things were key.
Yeah.
And at each level, until there was something beyond the initial introduction or foot in the door, there was still a disparity in getting the job.
Yeah. Constance's story is the one that's really key in the book to showing how these networks operate, right? And her story is really poignant because she comes out of this environment where she's finishing her PhD and she's feeling really nervous, right? She knows that it's time to get a job and she's just feeling uncertain about whether she has what it takes, about if she's really equipped to do the research. There's a lot of self-doubt there. And so this is one of the early places where we see her networks mattering, because her advisor is the one who really encourages her and says, you can do this. I understand you've got some doubts, but apply for a Research 1 job, which is kind of the holy grail in academic jobs, right? So
I've arrived.
Yes, exactly. Apply for this Research 1 job. Just try it out and then see how you feel. So she does. She applies. He pulls a lot of strings behind the scenes. She doesn't find out about that until much later. Right. But she gets into this job, but she finds out once she gets in there that she's switched specialty areas in her field. So all the credit that she had from working with her advisor, all the connections that he had, they pretty much stop mattering once she moves into this job. And then she finds herself having to build her networks again on her own. And for her, it's a terrible process. Yeah. It's so difficult. Being the one black woman in this environment where most of her colleagues are white men who aren't always very nice to her, who, don't necessarily reciprocate when she's trying to forge these connections. And she's a shy person anyway.
I was just going to say, trying meant a lot for her.
Yeah,
that's not her nature. Exactly. So now she has to manage that.
Exactly. So it just sets up these hurdles and barriers for Constance in particular. But it, again, really goes to show how much these connections and relationships have an outsized role in driving what happens to us at work in ways that, again, might create a lot of barriers for black workers. My experience was different. My father is a professor, and so he's given me a lot of advice. Some of it has been unsolicited advice, but it's been a lot of advice and information about things that I can and should do or should not do on the academic career track. But I also know for many black academics that is not the case. Most of us are not second-generation academics. Many of us are first-generation workers, right? So we don't have that same level of cultural capital. So it's a really critical factor that, again, doesn't show up in our job contracts and that no one usually tells you about when you're starting a position.
How do we even trace back the gray areas? Does it, if it's all the same, do we see it in high school? Do we see it before then?
In the book, I focus pretty exclusively on these in workplaces, but that's not to say that these only occur in workplaces, right? I think that there's probably a lot of groundwork in terms of the more invisible, more social, more cultural aspects of education, of peer groups, things like that, that also shape the paths that we get set on to forge our career paths over the long term. And I think a lot of those dynamics happen much earlier than when we get into the workplace. I like to focus on work specifically just because we spend so much of our time working, and we spend so much of our time at our jobs, and we've spent so much time as a society thinking about, or at least talking about, these questions of diversity. It is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and yet we really haven't seen the results to show for it. And I really wanted to talk about why. So I think there's
glad you did.
I think there's some groundwork for how we got there. But to me, this just really is a useful site for highlighting how these gray areas are present.
Oh, for sure. Well, we can't heal what we don't reveal.
Sure.
Is there a way to prepare then? Now that we know what it is, can I go into a job equipped for, this is what I can expect and how I can maybe mitigate it?
Yeah, I think it's useful for workers to have an idea of what to expect coming into these workplaces, that you are going to need these connections, that you do want to know what the organizational culture is, that you are going to have to forge these relationships with mentors and sponsors for advancement. But I actually want to push back a little against the idea about this being something that should be grounded in what workers are doing. Really, at the core of what I want to argue, I think, I think these have to be organizational solutions. I think that
you said leadership as well.
Exactly.
Right. Tell us how.
Yeah, I think it's really critical for companies to follow evidence-based steps to addressing these types of issues. Because it shouldn't be on individual workers, especially individual black workers, to come in and try to figure these things out. So we do know that there are some steps that companies can take to try to address some some of the issues that I talk about here. Companies can focus on mentoring programs that are available to everyone. They can change how they engage in recruitment processes so that they are more likely to attract more Black workers and to hire more Black workers. They can put into place programs where they are focused on diversity internally and bring in people from a variety of different levels in the organization and that offer the resources to put into place solutions. They can empower diversity managers who can keep people accountable and make sure that they are operating to collect data and have an eye towards these issues. So it's not a thing where there's nothing that companies can do, right? And it shouldn't be a thing where Black workers have to take it on themselves to identify all of these things preemptively and then structure their interactions in the workplace accordingly. That certainly doesn't hurt, but I really want to emphasize that I think organizations, again, if you're going to say that you're serious about diversity, which virtually all organizations do, you got to step up, right?
Well, that brings to mind, and I love that you included checklists. So just as you gave, these are some things you can do if you don't know organization and organizational leaders. Here are some ideas. What can we do to entice, compel, convict, sell, if we must, the value of taking these steps and changing the way our workplace culture and practices are?
Right. To me, this comes down to just practical thinking about where we are as a society and what our society looks like. We know, for example, that our society is becoming increasingly racially diverse, and that is simply a fact that is not changing. It's hard for me to see how organizations are prepared to meet the needs of a 21st century society and labor force if organizational demographics look so different from the populations that companies are serving. So to me, it just becomes a matter of practicality. If you as a company want to be prepared to meet the challenges of society, if you want to be the best organization that you can, if you really want to make sure that your organization is thriving, you can't do that if you're using outdated, old, yesterday's models of what a company looks like and does and how it operates. If you really want to meet the needs of today, you got to be a diverse organization that reflects the diversity of the population. And that means being more attuned to and aware of how Black workers' experiences are shaped in your organization and changing those for the better. Organizations fundamentally are driven by profits, right? They want to make money, and that is their bottom line. And again, it's hard to see how, as an organization, you are best situated to do that if you're holding yourself back from having access to a thriving, committed workforce of people who genuinely are tied to your organization and want to work for your company. And again, you cannot do that if you're not thinking about how bringing on Black workers and allowing them to thrive is going to require some organizational and cultural change. What does change is when an organization says, we're going to pull together a task force of people from different levels of the organization, and we're going to task them with identifying where we see disparities and suggesting solutions. When that mandate comes from leadership, when there are resources to actually do this work, when people are coming from all levels of the organization so they can say, here at the entry level, this is what I'm seeing, and here at middle management, this is what I'm seeing, and here in leadership, here's what I'm encountering. And when people are put in charge of identifying not just problems, but coming up with solutions, that's shown to really make a difference in how the people in that group feel about the problem and identify the problem, but also how leadership can respond to that problem. So those types of steps really matter.
Are there any unicorns, any organization that you can identify that's doing it well?
Yeah, so that's always a fun question. In the book, I do talk about 3 companies that have tried to address these with varying degrees of success. So I talk about Google as an example of a company that's tried to change some of their hiring practices. And they did so by trying to incorporate a program that included students from HBCUs to bring them in at the hiring level. By Google's own standards, and I cite their own internal report in the book, by their own standards, the program did not necessarily have the level of internal support that could have allowed it to flourish over time, and that had consequences for their ability to retain Black workers, Black women workers in particular. So that illustrates, again, these programs have been tried in some places, but you also have to have consistent support across the board. There's GV, a venture capital firm that I cite, that has taken specific steps to try to change the organizational culture using a lot of the initiatives that we know actually yield results. And I also refer to Coca-Cola, which usually surprises people.
I work there.
Yeah, okay. So they were sued for discrimination, I think in 2000, and put into place some of these evidence-based reforms. And over a period of time, did actually see a significant improvement to the numbers of Black vice presidents, particularly Black women vice presidents, in leadership roles. So again, things have changed post-COVID. Resources have not always been concentrated.
Right. But you're talking Coca-Cola, Google. I mean, is money an issue
exactly,
for these? Right?
Exactly.
It makes you wonder.
Yeah. So, I mean, these are questions, right? Why don't we see this consistently being a core part of long-term strategy for companies? But it also does show that there are companies that are taking these steps and are seeing some of the results that we talk about.
Would you say that this plays out in different fields? Like we talked about professional environments. Is this also for industrial, blue collar, engineers? I think you mentioned. How may it or may not differ?
Yeah. I think that the gray areas themselves are present across industries and across fields, but I think the particulars of how people experience them may differ to some degree depending on the industry that they are employed in. So, for example, one of the narratives that I include is Alex, who is primarily doing gig work. She's driving for Uber Eats and for DoorDash at the time. So her experiences are very different than someone like Constance, who's also a Black woman, but again is a professor in a STEM field with a very comfortable salary, benefits. So Alex's job is different. It's very contract-based. It doesn't involve a lot of interactions with other people. And one of the things that I learned from her is that because of that, she told me that she wasn't really experiencing discrimination at work. She just was driving food, dropping it off, and delivering it. It was allowing her to make ends meet, and she felt fine with that. But we also know, if you look more broadly at contract work in the gig economy, there's still a lot of room built in there for disparities to happen. Drivers have no way of knowing if they're being differentially tipped and rewarded than other drivers because there are no coworkers who are a basis for comparison. The way that algorithms are structured often means that Black people using these types of apps lose out, whether we're talking about Airbnb, Uber, or what have you, right? So her experience qualitatively is very different from someone like Constance, but if you look overall at how these gray areas are not working to their benefit, that's still consistent even though they're in different fields.
What do you hope you can change or impact with this book?
Yeah. So I think about that in three ways. One, I really hope that people who are leaders in organizations read the book and think, okay, maybe I wasn't aware this is happening in my workplace, but now that I know, I want to do things better. And I want to make changes so that Black workers in my company can thrive and really do well and succeed and maybe not have been having the experience that has not been so great. My other hope is that maybe workers of any racial background who are interested in understanding what Black workers experience at work, and these don't have to be leaders, these could just be any regular person, could read this book and think, okay, maybe I didn't know this was going on, but now that I do, I want to position myself to be more supportive, and I want to be in a position where I can do a better job to help create a better workplace for Black coworkers. But three, I really hope that Black workers will read this book and realize, okay, this wasn't all in my head. I wasn't making it up. I wasn't imagining things. All these things that I thought were happening, not only were these really happening, but these happen to Black workers in so many fields across the board. And it's really important for me, for Black workers to see and realize that, because I think, I spent my career studying this. I'm very aware of the data and the research, but again, most people aren't. And I think it's really easy for Black workers to go through their lives with these experiences and think, I'm not sure that really just happened. It feels like it happened, but maybe I'm just being too sensitive or I'm imagining things. You're not imagining things. You're not being too sensitive. This is real. It happens to you and it happens to so many others, and it's critical to know that.
I want to close with how you equipped yourself, because you live it too, and an appeal or encouragement to the rest of us to make it through.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Yeah, I mean, in terms of my own experience, I think, and I talk about this in the book, I think an innate stubbornness and refusal to let the haters win.
The competitive nature,
Exactly. That matters a lot. Like, I know what you're trying to do with these hate emails. You're not going to beat me. I'm not going to let you win. I can't have that. So that, that quite honestly is part of it. But when it comes to the advice that I would give other people to think about how to navigate these spaces, I would just really say that I know and understand that work is so hard and so difficult for so many people, but I really do think that there's opportunities for change and there's opportunities for growth and development. And I guess I think it's useful to hold tight to the hope for positive change that I do think we can achieve in workplaces. And I think it's possible for many companies to get there. And I would just encourage Black workers to hold on to that.
What is your invitation for folks to get into this book?
If you are a person who works, this is a book that I think you should read and
Right.
think about.
Simply,
If you are a person who works, this is going to have information that you may not already be aware of about race and racial inequality in workplaces. And I think I would end with this question. If you've ever asked yourself why 50 plus years after the Civil Rights Act and why in the wake of a huge multi-billion diversity industry, we still don't have racial parity at work, I think this will give you some answers.
Absolutely. I feel more empowered and appreciate all the time, hurt, and progress
Thank you.
that you endured in order to bring it to us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.